The fire is already crackling when the sky is still black. Ashes from last night's embers are stirred gently back to life by practiced hands. Outside, frost clings to the wooden beams of the longhouse, and inside, the air begins to shift from autumn-lace, cold and biting to warm and smoky. A pot hangs above the fire, water slowly heating, ready for grain. The animals, restless in their pens, groan and shift as the door creaks open. A cloaked figure steps out into the dim light barefoot on icy earth, carrying a wooden bucket in each hand. That's the beginning of her day, and you probably wouldn't survive it. Not the bitter cold before sunrise, not the hours of labor with Pa. No rest, and certainly not the responsibility resting on her shoulders. A Viking woman's life was carved from stone, just like the harsh lands she called home. Before we sink into the hearth-warmed rhythm of her world, don't forget to subscribe to the video sharing channel. There are many more stories whispered in the wind waiting just beyond this one. Now settle in. She's already busy. The Viking woman's day began long before anyone else's. She didn't rise with the sun. She often had to wake it. Her morning routine was a quiet symphony of survival, relighting the hearth from carefully banked coals, adding dried peat or birch bark to coax out warmth, and preparing the first meal before the others even stirred. She might have a babe swaddled against her chest, barely weeks old, still waking through the night. But the chores didn't wait. Even the smallest longhouse depended on her. Chickens needed feeding. Goats needed milking. If the cow had calved in the night, she might find both joy and anxiety out in the byre. An extra calf meant more milk, but also more mouths. She knew each animal's mood, each rut in the ground between house and pen, and whether a cloudy eye or warm udder meant illness or good health, and she did it all barefoot. In winter, more often than you'd think soft. Leather shoes weren't infinite, and snow was just snow. Inside, the longhouse still slept. Children curled under wool blankets on raised platforms, and her husband, if he wasn't off on a voyage, might stir when the smell of hot porridge filled the room. But often, she worked alone until the household began to hum. Morning also meant water. The stream could be half a mile away. In winter, it was often frozen. She carried it back by the bucket, shoulders aching, feet numb, and hands red. She might break ice with the back of an axe, or pull snow into a cauldron to melt. It's strange to think now, but in those early hours, the power in a Viking home was hers. The moment she woke, she took command over heat, hunger, and harmony. Of course, not every morning was peaceful. Children fought. Animals escaped. Fires died in the night. Sometimes she'd lose hours untangling wool that mice had nested in. And if a neighbor arrived flushed and breathless, asking for help, she had no choice but to stop everything and give it. Hospitality wasn't a luxury, it was a law. One cup of warm ale could mend a feud, or cause one. Interestingly, there are records of women being fined for not offering food to travelers, even if their own stores were low. That's how central her role was. Feed the home, feed the road. Keep the world spinning. In wealthier households, she might have had thrall servants, often captured in raids, who helped with daily work. But being a mistress of the house didn't mean she sat still. She worked alongside them, guiding their hands, keeping a watchful eye. And when things went wrong, as they often did, she was the one blamed. A cold house or empty belly was never the man's fault. Historians still debate whether Viking women preferred early mornings or simply endured them with resignation. It's hard to tell through the fog of time. But the sagas do speak of women as keepers of the hearth, a title that carried more weight than it seems. The hearth wasn't just for cooking, it was a sacred space tied to family fate, protected by charms and careful rituals. If that fire died, especially during winter, it was seen as a terrible omen. And yet, these women didn't just keep it burning, they thrived beside it. Some mornings, she might even sing while stirring the pot, or hum a lullaby passed down from her grandmother. These songs, unrecorded, uncredited, were the real oral history, whispered between rising steam and the squeal of a wooden spoon. One odd fact? In some Icelandic regions, women used to place iron knives under their bedding or beside the hearth to protect the house from night spirits. A strange superstition. Maybe, but it tells you something about the balance of fear and power in her world. She didn't just cook. She warded off demons. Around mid-morning, when the family finally rose and ate, her work didn't stop. She handed out tasks, ensured the children watched over their squabbles, and reminded everyone sternly about shoes, cloaks, or the goat that needed checking. Her voice was the first commandment of the day. She was mother, manager, healer, negotiator, and peacekeeper, and it wasn't even noon yet. One small but telling historical event comes from the Gokstad ship burial site in Norway. While primarily known for the male warrior buried there, nearby grave goods included household tools, weaving equipment, and even imported spices, suggesting a powerful woman may have been entombed with similar honors, her domestic skills considered worthy of eternal remembrance. And maybe that's the lesson. While Viking men get tales of swords and sails, it was the women who carved history out of rhythm and routine. Their power didn't come from battle cries, it came from quiet, relentless presence. So as the morning sun crests the hills and spills golden light into the longhouse, the Viking woman is already onto her next task, humming, planning, moving forward. Not because she has to, but because the entire house is waiting. The loom dominates the back of the longhouse. It stands tall, towering like a silent sentry near the firelight. Weighted by smooth stones and strung with long threads, it waits for her fingers to return like it always does. In a Viking woman's world, the work of weaving was never done and never optional. Wool wasn't just clothing. It was currency, identity, and insulation against a deathly cold that showed no mercy. And she made it all, one thread at a time. You can almost see her there, seated low, bent forward with a spindle spinning between her fingers. The whirring sound is hypnotic, rhythmic, steady. It's like watching someone pull warmth straight from thin air, twisting raw fleece into something useful, even beautiful. Wool came from their own sheep, of course, short-tailed, scruffy little things, bred for hardiness rather than charm. In spring, they were sheared with bone or iron tools, a task requiring patience and persistence. From there, the fleece had to be cleaned, combed, dyed, spun, and only then woven. And every step of that journey belonged to her. Oddly enough, urine played a part too. It was used to clean and set dyes. Viking women collected it in buckets for this purpose, which made for some lively-smelling workdays. But it also made the colors last: reds from madder root, deep blues from woad, and dusky yellows from birch leaves. And once dyed and dried, the real work began. The vertical loom was no small feat. It required strength and knowledge. Each thread had to be placed with intention, each pass of the shuttle as smooth as breath. Mistakes meant hours lost. One wrongly placed warp thread could ruin everything. It's why young girls began learning to spin as early as age 5. By the time they were adults, their fingers were quick and sure, like musicians playing invisible instruments. What's fascinating is that cloth in Viking society wasn't just for clothing. It was a form of trade and taxation. Women produced the fabric that clothed families and paid debts. There are even legal records where fines were paid in woven wool. So yes, the loom was a business, and the woman was the CEO. And fashion. Don't let the rough exterior fool you. Viking women knew style. Long dresses layered over tunics, secured with ornate brooch at the shoulders, chains dangling across their chests with scissors, combs, keys, and beads. These weren't decorations, they were daily tools, worn like status symbols. One brooch from a burial in Denmark was inlaid with imported glass, showing just how valuable these items could be. There's also something deeply symbolic about the way cloth was used in life and in death. Babies were swaddled in it. Brides wore it with pride. And the dead? They were wrapped in it too, one final gift from the hands that spun their first cradle cloths. Historians still debate whether Viking women wove purely out of duty or found creative expression in the patterns and color combinations. Some fragments show intricate diamond and chevron designs, suggesting that artistry flourished even within constraint. Maybe that's what made the task bearable, beauty rising out of repetition. And then there's linen. More delicate, more prized. Grown from flax, which took months of careful tending. The plant had to be pulled, not cut. Soaked, dried, beaten, combed, and finally spun. And if you're wondering who handled all of that, yes, it was her again. Every thread in a Viking home came through her hands. But weaving wasn't done in isolation. It was often communal. On long winter evenings, women gathered together, working by firelight, gossiping, joking, sometimes singing. Picture it. The warm buzz of voices, the clack of looms, the sigh of wind outside the walls. That was their social circle, their therapy, their parliament. And their power. One woman might weave for a dozen. Another might trade her cloth for mead, or favors. In that way, her influence extended far beyond the hearth. Her fabric touched warriors and traders, farmers and chieftains. It crossed oceans. In fact, pieces of Viking wool have been found in burial mounds as far as Eastern Europe. The story of weaving is often left out of the sagas. There are no dramatic sword fights around the loom, no burning villages over the price of thread. But, make no mistake, her skill kept her world clothed, her family warm, her community functioning. And not every loom was stationary. Some wealthier women, traveling with their husbands on expeditions or to market, brought small portable looms table-sized and easy to pack. Yes, even on the road, the work continued. One historical account from a 10th century Irish monk described Viking markets where women sold not only wool but dyed fabric pre-cut into tunics ready to wear, ready to trade. It's a glimpse into a hidden economy run not with coins, but with calluses and color. And here's something strange. There's evidence that women were buried with weaving tools tucked into their graves, not just as tokens, but as essential gear for the afterlife. As if the gods themselves expected her to keep weaving. Even in Valhalla, a joke passed down in some rural Icelandic regions. A woman with idle hands must be dead. It's funny until you realize how true it was. So picture her, hours into the afternoon, surrounded by her work. Threads dangling, hands flying, eyes sharp as knives. Children play nearby. The fire hisses. Outside, the wind carries the smell of earth and wood smoke. And within the quiet rhythm of the loom, she's not just making clothes. She's making history. The smoke curls from the hearth, heavy with the smell of simmering broth. Outside, the wind howls through the thatched roof, rattling the wooden shutters. But inside the longhouse, the air is thick with warmth and the scent of barley, onion, and dried herbs. Dinner won't be served for hours, but the work of preparing it began long ago, possibly before breakfast had even ended. Food wasn't a convenience. It was a campaign. And for the Viking woman, the kitchen was a battlefield she faced every single day. She didn't just cook. She harvested, butchered, preserved, and rationed. With long winters and limited supplies, every meal was an act of strategy. A successful one meant survival. A miscalculation meant hunger. Or worse, the Viking diet was rugged and resourceful. Bread was the backbone, coarse loaves made from barley, rye, or oats, mixed with buttermilk or water, and baked on flat stones beside the fire. No yeast, no fluff. Just hearty rounds to fill a stomach and stretch the stores. She might even toss in birch bark flour when grain ran low. Yes, bark. The forest was a backup pantry. Fish was plentiful: cod, herring, salmon caught by the men or boys and salted, dried, or smoked to preserve. The woman's job? Gutting, cleaning, and preparing it for storage. In some households, drying racks hung above the longhouse rafters. It wasn't the most fragrant ceiling decor, but it kept bellies full, And the meat? That was more precious. Slaughtering livestock was reserved for winter, when the animals couldn't survive the cold and feed. Ran short. The Viking woman knew which to keep and which to cull. She was part farmer, part accountant. One wrong decision in October could mean starvation by February. Oddly, it was the head and hooves that often made their way into the pot, nose to tail. Wasn't a trend, it was a necessity. She knew how to turn scraps into stew, marrow into broth, blood into sausage. Waste nothing. Not even the fat. That rendered fat, by the way, served many uses. For cooking, yes. But also as lamp oil, soap, waterproofing, even as a remedy for dry skin, though. Don't expect any spa treatments in this story. Viking beauty. Routines were practical and, shall we say, fragrant. Herbs were gathered in the summer, wild onions, dill, garlic mustard, and yarrow dried and stored in leather pouches or clay pots. She might tuck a handful into the stew pot, not just for flavor, but for their healing properties. This wasn't just dinner, it was medicine, disguised as a meal. Milk was churned into butter or soured into skyr, a type of Viking yogurt still eaten in Iceland today. It's tangy, thick, and surprisingly rich in protein. Cheese was soft, crumbly, and kept in small wheels. A dairy-rich diet helped supplement the lack of meat, but it required constant tending. Ever tried hand-churning butter for an hour? Add a crying toddler and a smoking hearth to the mix. Now imagine doing it daily. Historians still debate whether Viking meals were monotonous or surprisingly varied. Some argue that trade routes brought in dried fruits, spices, and even wine. Others believe these luxuries were reserved for the elite. Most women likely worked with what they had: root vegetables, salted meats, and determination. She didn't just feed her family. She planned for the future. Summer and autumn were frenzied seasons, drying herbs, pickling vegetables, hanging meats, brewing ale. A single misstep could spoil an entire store of food, and spoilage didn't just mean waste. It meant danger. Food poisoning wasn't a joke when your only remedy was herbal tea and hope. And that brings us to one curious culinary artifact: bog butter. Yes, really. Archaeologists have discovered large lumps of ancient butter buried in peat bogs across Ireland and Scotland. Some are thousands of years old. These bogs acted as natural refrigerators, cool, low-oxygen environments perfect for preservation. And while it's unclear whether Viking women used the same method, it wouldn't be surprising. After all, peat bogs were everywhere, and butter was worth its weight in silver. The fire roars as she lifts a pot from the hearth, careful not to let it tip. The children gather around. One sneaks a root vegetable when her back is turned. She notices but says nothing, just smirks, her hands too busy kneading dough to chase anyone. Dinner is a shared event. There are no personal plates. Food is ladled into wooden bowls and passed around. Fingers are used as often as spoons. Stories are told. Jokes are shared. It's a noisy, smoky, messy ritual that binds the family together. One official account from the fine Norse colonies in Greenland describes how families would eat whale meat boiled with seaweed during hard winters. The smell was memorable. But they lived because a Viking woman found a way. And she didn't just cook for family, guests, travelers, the occasional skald, a traveling poet. All expected food and warmth. Offering a meal was law and honor. Refusing could cause insult, even revenge. She had to be ready. Always. Ever wonder why so many Viking kitchens were stocked like bunkers? Why meats hung from rafters and barrels lined the walls? Because she never let the pot go empty. Not if she could help it. One light joke passed around hearths: if your wife can't make soup from snow and wind, she's not ready to marry. It always got a chuckle because everyone knew she could. She did. And as the fire faded into glowing coals, she washed the bowls, scraped the pot, and tucked away what little was left. Tomorrow would need more bread, more broth, more patience. But for now, she sits down beside the hearth, sore and silent. Watching the children sleep and the embers blink like lazy stars. No glory song will sing of this moment. No saga will praise the hand that stirred the pot. But without her, there would be no saga at all. The cries echo through the long house, sharp, gasping, raw. Somewhere in the dim light, a woman clenches a fistful of straw, her hair slick with sweat, her voice cracked with pain. No soothing music, no sterile linens, no doctors. Only earth, blood, and breath. And at her side, steady and unflinching, is another woman. She's done this before. She knows when to speak softly and when to bark a command. She knows how to press on the belly, when to pull, when to wait, and she knows how to keep her fear out of her eyes. Because right now, someone's life depends on it. Childbirth in the Viking Age was a gamble every time. And for the Viking woman, motherhood wasn't just a role, it was a right of survival. She might give birth 6, 7, even 10 times in her life. But not every child would live. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Fever, infection, breech births, all common, all deadly. There were no epidurals, no antiseptics, no guarantees. Oddly enough, Viking women gave birth in the same longhouse where they cooked, wove, and slept. Sometimes on straw, sometimes on furs. She might kneel, squat, or sit on a birthing stool if she had one. These stools had a hole in the middle, allowing gravity to help while other women stood behind, offering support or holding the mother steady. There's an old superstition that birthing stools had to be carved from a single piece of wood to prevent spirits from slipping through the cracks. Strange? Perhaps. But when pain fills the room and life hangs by a thread, even the irrational begins to feel wise. If she was lucky, she had other women to help, her mother, her sisters, maybe an experienced neighbor. A kind of informal midwifery passed down by memory and story. There was no medical training, only instinct, observation, and the collective wisdom of generations. Historians still debate whether certain women served as professional midwives in Viking society. Some graves contain tools associated with childbirth: scissors, herbs, and amulets, but we don't know if these women were specialists or simply experienced mothers. Either way, their hands delivered the next generation. After birth, the child was laid on the mother's chest if all was well. But the ritual wasn't over. A crucial moment followed: the vatni, the water rite. This was a kind of naming ceremony where the infant was sprinkled with water and given their name. It was not yet Christian baptism, but it was sacred. Until then, the child wasn't truly counted as part of the family. Some infants didn't live to receive their names. This was the harsh reality. And here's a darker truth. If a child was born too weak, too sickly, or if the household couldn't feed another mouth, infanticide wasn't unheard of. The father had the legal right to expose the child, usually by leaving it outside. A horrifying decision, but one that families, especially the poorest, sometimes made. Still, most mothers clung fiercely to their babies. They nursed them, wrapped them tightly in wool, sang lullabies laced with old magic. One soft tune, still preserved in Icelandic verse, calls on the goddess Frigg to shield the child from cold and illness. Even the gods were called upon in those fragile days. Breastfeeding continued for years. There were no bottles, no formula. A child might nurse well into toddlerhood, both for nourishment and comfort. The mother ate more during this time when she could to maintain her strength, and when milk ran low. Goat's milk, if they had it. If not, gruel-thin porridge laced with honey, if the bees had been kind. The role of mother stretched far beyond infancy. She taught the child to speak, to walk, to behave. She taught them how to spin wool, carve wood, tend to animals. Her daughters watched her hands as much as they heard her voice. Her sons learned kindness or cruelty by how she treated the thralls. One famous archaeological site, Trelleborg Fortress in Denmark, revealed children's toys buried beside adult tools. Small wooden animals, carved swords, dolls made of cloth. It's a tender reminder. Even in this brutal age, childhood existed. And Viking mothers nurtured it. And yet, the threat of loss lingered always. Diseases swept through settlements. Fires destroyed longhouses. Raids came without warning. A mother had to prepare her children for the worst and be ready to survive them. Some women buried several children in their lifetimes, some none at all. One odd tradition? Viking mothers sometimes tied iron keys or knives into the cradles, believing these would ward off malevolent spirits thought to steal breath or cause nightmares. If a child cried out in the night, the mother would mutter charms, rock them, or blow smoke. From burned herbs across the blanket, even grief had its rituals. If a child died, the mother washed the body herself. She wrapped it in cloth she may have woven years ago, not knowing it would become a shroud. She would place small tokens, a bead, a toy, a carved stone, beside the body before burial, and then, with red eyes and empty arms, she would return. To the hearth, there was no time to collapse. The animals still needed feeding. The stew still needed stirring. Life demanded presence, even in mourning. But motherhood wasn't only sorrow. It was laughter and games, warm hugs and wool-scented kisses. It was watching a child take their first steps across a dirt floor, hearing them recite a story by firelight, seeing them grow tall and strong, wearing the tunic she stitched, eating the bread she baked. In a world where death was always near, love burned brighter, and so she kept going. She held her children close, taught them to be clever and brave. She built their future thread by thread, lesson by lesson. And when they left off to war, to marriage, to market, she whispered the old blessing, "May your shield hold, and your luck be stronger than steel." Because in the end, all she could give them was her labor, her love, and the will to endure. There's a whisper in the long grass and a stirring beneath the ash tree. A child coughs. A man groans in his sleep. But the Viking woman moves quietly, already halfway to the edge of the clearing, with a small woven pouch tucked at her waist. The sun isn't up yet. The dew is thick, and the forest smells of damp bark and crushed leaves. She crouches beside a patch of stinging nettles and plucks them with care. Not for dinner. For healing. A Viking woman wasn't just the heart of the home. She was the healer of the household. Her hands carried generations of herbal knowledge, ancient, unwritten, and priceless. In every Viking settlement, a woman like her existed. Some were specialists, revered and sometimes feared. Others were simply mothers who learned which roots soothed a fever or which leaves stopped bleeding. Medicine in the Viking world was an art stitched together from plants, prayer, and practice. And there was no formal training. No scrolls, no surgical diagrams. Just experience. And scars. Inside her pouch might be yarrow for cuts, juniper for coughs, angelica root for digestion, and maybe even henbane for pain or visions, depending on the dose. She didn't need Latin names. She knew the plants by their smell, shape, and when they bloomed. She knew which ones grew only in shade, which needed to be dried upside down, and which were poison if boiled too long. One curious example? Mistletoe. To us, it's a holiday decoration. To her, it was sacred, used in small doses to treat seizures or anxiety. Too much, and it could be deadly. So she measured by pinch, not scale. Trusting her fingers, not a number. When a child came down with a cough, she'd reach for thyme boiled into tea. If a man limped home with a gash from a bad fall, she'd pack it with moss and wrap it with wool. And when the fevers came, because they always came, she'd keep vigil through the night, wiping sweat, whispering charms, and praying to the fanged. Old gods for mercy. Historians still debate whether Viking women believed in the power of herbs more than the will of the gods. But one thing is certain, when both failed, it was the woman who bore the blame. And when they succeeded, she received. No songs, just a quiet nod. Maybe, interestingly, the sagas mention wise women who knew the healing arts. Not all of them were praised. Some were labeled as fuelkunnig or deep in magic, a word that danced dangerously close to witchcraft. Healing was respected, but feared when it crossed into mystery. In fact, many healing rituals were accompanied by chants or gestures, not just herbs. A poultice might be laid down while whispering a protective rhyme. A charm might be worn on the wrist of a fevered child, carved with runes of health. Was it medicine? Magic? To her, it didn't matter. Only the result did, and the result was this: the sick got better. Or they didn't. Single quotes. One small but telling archaeological find in Sweden revealed a pouch buried with a woman that contained crushed bones, plant remains, and a carved bone needle, likely a healer's kit. Whether she was feared or loved, she was remembered. Because she mattered. Oddly, Viking women also used their herbal knowledge for the living and the dead. Before a funeral, the body was sometimes washed with scented herbs, sage, meadowsweet, and pine. This wasn't just for cleanliness. It was ritual, protection, farewell, and it was the woman's task to prepare it. She was the first to welcome life, and the last to send it off. One light joke passed between older women at the time went something like, "If it smells strong, it's healing. You are hiding something worse." And they'd laugh, because humor softened the weight of their role. Herbalism wasn't just a skill. It was a bond with the land. In spring, she wandered the woods with baskets and bags, teaching her daughters what to pick, what to leave. In summer, she hung bunches to dry over the beams. In fall, she packed clay jars and wrapped them in linen for the long cold ahead. She did this every year, every season, without fail. And sometimes, when words failed and pain wouldn't ease, she offered something else. Stories. She might tell of Ire, the Norse goddess of healing who walked the world in silence, easing wounds no one else could. She might joke that Ire never had to chase a goat mid-fever or calm a weeping husband with a poultice and a cup of sour ale. But in the quiet moments, she believed in her all the same. And when someone lived, when the child woke with clear eyes, when the man stood without pain, when the fever broke at dawn, she didn't cheer. She just nodded and reached for the next bundle of herbs, because someone else would need her tomorrow. And if she didn't know what to do, she'd experiment. One peculiar case tells of a woman who tried spiderwebs soaked in vinegar to stop bleeding. And you know what? It worked. Modern science confirms that spider silk has natural clotting properties. But she didn't have a lab, just intuition and luck. This is the kind of genius that history forgets. So tonight, as the stars blink into view and the longhouse settles into sleep, she checks her jars one last time. She ties the herbs tighter, moves the smoke-dried roots to a drier spot, whispers a few words to the rafters, just in case the spirits are listening. And she rests her head knowing this: tomorrow, someone will fall. Someone will cough. Someone will cry out in the night, and she will rise, not with glory, but with nettles in her hands. The long ship is gone, a thin line on the horizon, swallowed by mist, salt, and waves. Its sail, striped in red and white, flutters one last time before vanishing into the unknown. Left behind on the shore, the woman adjusts her cloak and turns back toward the village, her jaw tight. There's no time to weep, no room for fear. Her husband has sailed, and that means the farm, the livestock, the family, everything is now in her hands. When the Viking men left for war or trade, it was the women who ran the world. And they did it well. This wasn't unusual. Viking women were used to holding down the fort, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The men might be raiding the coasts of England, selling wares in Byzantium, or simply hunting seals across frozen fjords. And in that absence, it was the woman who became leader, laborer, and lawmaker all in one. She didn't just manage the household, she commanded it. And she had the keys to prove it. Literally. In Viking society, the woman of the house wore a keyring. At her waist, a bundle of small, clinking keys hung from her brooches. They opened food stores, chests of valuables, boxes of tools, even hidden compartments in the floorboards. The sound of her walking meant access, control, and authority. Oddly enough, those keys sometimes appear in Viking women's graves, a symbol not just of her role, but of her power, and managing the homestead wasn't a small job. There were crops to tend: barley, rye, oats, and a growing season so short that every day counted. The fieldwork was brutal. She swung the scythe, sowed the seeds, bundled the harvest. If there were thralls, she gave the orders. If not, she did it all herself. She also managed livestock: goats, sheep, cows. She watched for illness, arranged breeding, and made sure the animals were fed through the winter. One sick goat could mean no milk. One broken fence meant a long night. She had to be good with tools, repairing carts, fixing harnesses, sharpening knives. No time to wait for someone else. Her hands were calloused and her eyes were sharp, and if a dispute broke out among neighbors, she was the one to settle it. Viking society had strict laws, some of the earliest in Europe, but justice wasn't always delivered in court. Often, it started around the hearth. A good woman knew how to negotiate, how to trade favors, and how to avoid full-blown feuds. Her tongue could be sharper than a sword, and she used it often. One historical event that highlights this power is the story of Odd the Deep-Minded, a wealthy widow who led her family across the sea and settled in Iceland. She built farms, founded communities, and held ceremonies on her own land. She was respected, feared, and remembered. Odd wasn't an exception. She was a possibility. Of course, not every woman ruled a clan, but many were de facto heads of household, and the line between domestic work and leadership blurred quickly when there was no man around. One odd and rarely mentioned role of the woman alone at home. She sometimes had to defend it. There are scattered tales, half legend, half history, of women fending off raiders or thieves while their husbands were away. Armed with axes, boiling water, or just bad tempers, they fought back. In some rare cases, they even formed militias. The line between housewife and warrior wasn't as firm as one might think. Historians still debate how common this was. Some believe these were isolated acts, romanticized over time. Others argue that any society leaving women alone for months had to train them for self-defense. After all, there were no police. Only you, the door bar, and your will. One preserved runestone depicts a woman seated in a high seat, surrounded by what appears to be family and retainers. Some scholars believe this may show her acting as a temporary chieftain, a stand-in leader, making decisions while the Lord was away. And perhaps the most difficult part, she did all this while waiting for a knock that might never come, for a messenger with news good or grim, for the first glimpse of a sail on the sea. Every creak of the wind, every cry from the seagulls might set her heart racing. She was not allowed to crumble under that weight. Not when the fields needed tending. One light joke that may have passed between Viking women went, "If the goats obey you and the kids don't, you're doing fine." A grim smile, a little nod, and then back to work. Because alone didn't mean abandoned. She still hosted guests, still arranged marriages, still maintained rituals and watched the stars for omens. She told the children stories to keep them hopeful, sang them to sleep with lullabies that had traveled across oceans. And when winter came and frost painted the inside of the walls, it was her fire that burned. Her presence, more than the wood or wool, kept the longhouse warm. And so, when the longships finally returned, when boots touched wet sand and voices called out through the fog, the woman didn't rush down the hill. She waited by the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. The man came home to find the house standing, the animals fed, the children grown, and his wife unshaken. That was the true strength of the Viking woman alone, not just her survival, but her ability to make everyone else survive too. The loom creaked softly. Threads stretch like sunbeams across the wooden frame, and nimble fingers guide the shuttle back and forth, back and forth. The rhythm is hypnotic, almost like breathing. In a smoky longhouse corner, a Viking woman leans forward, brows furrowed, calculating patterns older than memory. She's not just weaving cloth. She's weaving wealth. Textiles weren't simply for keeping warm. In Viking society, woven goods, especially wool, were currency, status symbols, heirlooms, even offerings to the gods. And women? They were the undisputed masters of this economy. Cloth wasn't just made by women. It was valued through them. The process began with the sheep. Viking sheep were small and hardy, bred for thick wool that grew in layers, a soft undercoat, and a coarse outer layer. Sheared by hand with iron scissors, the wool had to be washed, carded, dyed, and spun, each step demanding skill and patience. And then came the loom. Viking looms were vertical, tall enough that the warp threads hung like vines. Weaving on such looms required standing, lifting, and leaning for hours. The women, often assisted by daughters or thralls, wove wool into everything from tunics to sails. Yes, sails, that's where things get serious. Historians still debate whether Viking women wove the massive wool sails that powered longships across the seas. Some believe specialist male weavers took on the task. Others argue it was women who did the work, in groups, over months, maybe years. One estimate says a single sail required the wool of up to 200 sheep. Imagine that. An entire village might work together to produce just one. And woven goods weren't just practical, they were profitable. Traders bartered bolts of cloth for silver, spices, amber, and slaves. A skilled woman could raise her family's status simply by the quality of her thread. One official historical record from the Hidibi trading settlement shows large-scale textile production, including dye pits and weaving huts. Archaeologists found spindle whorls, loom weights, and remnants of cloth dyed in madder red, woad blue, and onion skin yellow. Hidibi's prosperity likely rested on the shoulders of weavers, and let's not forget the finer things. Embroidery, intricate, colorful, and full of symbolism, was a woman's art. Patterns reflected the seasons, the gods, the myths. Some had protective power. A hem stitched with runes could ward off misfortune. A baby's blanket might include symbols of Thor or Freya. It wasn't just decoration, it was a form of prayer. One odd fact: Viking women sometimes spun thread with a drop spindle while walking, talking, even arguing. The sight of a woman spinning with one hand and chopping leeks with the other wasn't rare. Some carried their spindles like accessories, proof that productivity never paused. Even funerals were wrapped in fabric. Literally, dog graves often contained shrouds, embroidered garments, or pieces of unfinished work. One woman was buried with a loom weight still in her hand, as if caught mid-task. In one case, a piece of textile buried with a woman burqa bore gold thread. Gold in thread. We're not talking peasant crafts here. The idea that weaving was women's work undersells its power. Because whoever controlled the cloth controlled the comfort. She dressed her family in tunics that lasted through wind and war. She made blankets thick enough to soften a stone floor. She traded spare fabric for iron tools. And if her son needed a gift to court a bride, she wove it. Cloth was her language. One light joke passed in quiet spinning circles might have gone, "You can tell a woman's temper by the tightness of her thread." A giggle, a knowing look. And then the spindle spun on. In wealthier households, weaving became specialized. A woman might supervise a team, daughters, sisters, even hired workers to meet demand. Quality textiles brought invitations to markets, alliances through gifting, even praise from jarls. The better her cloth, the more doors opened. It was back-breaking and eye-straining work. But in a world where coins were rare, a bolt of wool was real power. And the rhythms of weaving became part of memory. Children fell asleep to the sound of the shuttle. Husbands returned to find new cloaks draped over benches. And every thread told a story, some too worn to read, others waiting in perfect Lines for someone to notice. Historians still debate whether women were the sole producers of high-end trade cloth. Some suspect guilds or male artisans were involved. Others point out that nearly all the textile tools found in graves belonged to women. Until more evidence surfaces, the loom remains a battlefield of scholarly whispers. But one thing's clear. Viking cloth wasn't rough rags and potato sacks. It was color. It was pride. It was trade, status, identity, and almost always, it began in a woman's hands. She didn't just clothe the village, she made it valuable. The fire crackles in the hearth, and smoke curls lazily toward the rafters. Outside, winter howls through the thatched roof, but inside the longhouse, warmth radiates from more than just the flames. A bowl of stewed cabbage and barley passes. From hand to hand, and in the circle of light, the storyteller begins. But this time, it's not the skald who speaks. It's the grandmother, and her tales carry just as much weight. The role of Viking women in oral tradition wasn't a footnote, it was a pillar. Because memory, for the Norse, wasn't written in books. It lived in people. And women? They were the vaults. They remembered the births, the deaths, the debts, the blood feuds, the oaths sworn and broken, the songs sung during harvest and the omens seen in spring. This wasn't trivial chatter. It was law, legacy, and cultural glue. One official historical event that highlights this role comes from the saga of Unn the Deep-Minded. A widow of noble rank, Unn fled Norway after her family's fall from power. She sailed to Iceland, yes, led the voyage herself and became one of the first female settlers. She distributed land, married off her kin, and, on her deathbed, hosted a grand feast where she passed down her story. And what a story it was. Even centuries later, the saga preserves her name. Because someone, likely another woman, remembered. You see, while men shouted their victories in battle, women whispered theirs into the ears of children. And when those children grew, they carried the whispers forward. Like invisible inheritance, there's an odd fact tucked into one saga. A woman who recites 3 generations of genealogy during a marriage proposal negotiation, complete with livestock. Counts. She's not a show-off. She's the keeper of the ledger. In many longhouses, women controlled not just food and fabric, but also facts. Family history wasn't a hobby. It was vital to inheritance, alliances, and honor. A misremembered name could insult a neighbor. A forgotten feud might trigger a blood price. And so, mothers and grandmothers drilled the names, dates, and stories into their children's minds like sacred runes. Even spiritual stories flowed through female lips. Freyja's myths, the tales of the Norns goddesses who wove fate, resonated deeply with Viking women. It wasn't unusual to hear bedtime stories that ended with ... and that's why we never walk under hawthorn trees before spring. Historians still debate whether these oral traditions were codified into specific female roles or simply passed along informally. Some suggest certain women were honored as keepers of lore. Others believe memory duties were universal, born of necessity. But whatever the case, the Longhouse was a theater of memory. And a woman's voice? It echoed longer than any sword clash. Even lullabies had power. There's a reconstructed fragment of a Viking Age cradle song. It warns the child about trolls, praises Thor's hammer, and promises that mother watches over him even when he dreams. Sweet, yes, but also packed with cultural data. That's Viking bedtime. Half comfort, half cosmic security system. And then there were the runes. While most rune carving was done by men, usually for public markers or curses, classic, some women were taught to read them. One rune stick, found in Bergen, bears what looks suspiciously like a woman's private message. Think of me often. Possibly flirtatious. Possibly tragic. But that raises eyebrows, because women weren't just passive listeners in this society of stories. They could wield knowledge with sharp precision. One woman might memorize a legal precedent to defend her dowry. Another might recite a saga to shame a neighbor. Gossip? No, These were acts of social warfare that an elderly woman might chuckle and say, "I remember when your grandfather dropped his axe in the river because he mistook a seal for a ghost." Cue the laughter. Cue the power. Because storytelling was status. And in Viking culture, memory had layers. There was the heroic layer kings and conquest, the mythic layer gods and monsters. But then there was the domestic layer, often guarded by women, who made the best butter, who sewed during the eclipse, whose marriage was cursed from the first sneeze. It was said, jokingly, that women could remember a debt longer than a saga could sing it. A light joke from the hearth might go, "You forget to feed a pig once," and 30 winters later, she's still telling your daughter's daughter about it. The laughter softened, but the lesson stuck. And when winter dragged on too long, and the ice crept toward the door, it was the stories that kept spirits warm. They reminded people of their roots, their rights, their gods. And in the quiet moments between chores, a woman's voice could paint entire worlds without ever standing up. Historians still debate whether saga transmission was a formal role passed down through maternal lines. Some believe it was incidental. Others insist on structured memory training. But either way, the effect was the same. Without women, the Norse wouldn't have had a past. So the next time you imagine a Viking warrior returning from a raid, don't picture him basking in glory, alone. Picture him sitting cross-legged by the fire, nodding as his mother retells the tale of how his grandfather once bested a berserker by slipping on a goose, and picture him laughing, because her voice carried everything. The gods, the gossip, the glories, and she never forgot a thing. A baby's first cry echoes through the longhouse, but no one panics. Midwives move swiftly. One places hot stones near cloth-wrapped herbs. Another checks the bindings. Outside, snow falls in hushed layers, but inside, a new Viking has entered the world, and a woman just earned her place in legend. Childbirth in the Viking Age wasn't merely biological, it was spiritual, communal, and deeply symbolic. It was also perilous. No medical textbooks, no antiseptic, no second chances. Yet somehow, generations endured. And Viking women, they bore it all with strength, ritual, and stories that whispered louder than screams. Picture it. A woman's water breaks while tending to sheep. She doesn't cry out. She walks back to the longhouse. Inside, her sister prepares the birth stool. Her mother crushes herbs into a poultice. Her aunt recites a charm to Freya, asking the goddess to loosen the bones and guard the breath. Everyone has a part to play. The birthing chair, or fiangarstel, wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Three-legged, carved with symbols of protection, it allowed gravity and strength to work together. Women gripped its handles like warriors grasping axe hilts. And in a way, they were at war against death, against weakness, against the cold. Silence that could follow a stillborn night. There's an official historical reference to this in the Icelandic saga of Laxdæla. A woman named Gudrun gives birth during a violent storm. The tale paints her as calm, composed, even sarcastic. When her husband complains about the wind, she replies, "The storm outside bothers you? Try this one inside." That's one light joke for the saga books. Oddly enough, in some Viking burials, small amulets shaped like scissors or tweezers are found beside women's bones. Archaeologists still debate whether these were personal grooming tools or symbols of midwifery. Because midwives didn't just deliver babies. They managed crises, stopped hemorrhaging with wool and herbs, and whispered charms believed to protect both souls. Historians still debate whether Viking women practiced actual medicine or relied solely on superstition. Evidence suggests it was a mix. Birch bark and yarrow for bleeding, goose fat for infection, iron scissors placed near the head to ward off evil spirits. It wasn't science by modern standards, but it often worked, and when it didn't, the community remembered. If a mother died in childbirth, her funeral was not like others. Mourners left offerings, silver beads, tokens of Freya, even baby clothes beside her. She was not just mourned, she was honored. In some circles, dying in childbirth was considered as noble as falling in battle. Think about that. A shield maiden and a mother, both warriors in different arenas. Then came naming. A newborn didn't just receive a name. It was gifted. Usually after 8 or 9 days, during a ceremony called the Nafnfesting. If the child survived that first week, a critical time, they were sprinkled with water, a symbolic rite, not unlike baptism, named aloud, and introduced to ancestors. Names were heavy with history. A boy might be named after his grandfather, who split his skull on a Saxon ship. A girl might inherit the name of her great-grandmother, famous for her dyed wool and sharp tongue. Names carried luck, curses, pride. They weren't just sounds, they were destiny in syllables. One light joke often passed around and reconstructed. Folklore goes like this: name a child after someone wise, and they'll ask too many questions. Name them after a fool, and at least you'll know what to expect. Now imagine a village celebrating. The longhouse smells of baked honey bread. Women laugh as they pass the baby from lap to lap, checking for strong fingers, clear eyes, good lungs. A grandmother whispers, "This one kicks like a goat, he'll farm or fight." In some cases, runes were carved with the child's name on wooden sticks and hung above the cradle. Not for luck, for memory, so the child's identity wouldn't be lost to wandering spirits. But what about those who didn't survive? There's a strange and touching detail from a burial site in Sweden, a tiny grave with no body, only a cradle charm and a few pebbles. Perhaps a stillbirth, perhaps a symbolic burial. Either way, it tells us something profound, even the briefest. Lives were marked with ritual. Viking women, though fierce, were never indifferent. Historians still debate the existence of formal birth rituals beyond these fragmentary finds. Some suggest localized traditions. Others believe spiritual midwives known as Leknir Connor carried oral prayers that were never written down. But what remains is the intensity of care, passed down through gestures, not ink. And when the baby grew, the mother's role shifted again. She nursed, sang, and watched like a hawk. Breastfeeding typically lasted up to 2 years. Longer during times of famine, when goat's milk wasn't an option. Viking mothers understood the stakes. A sick child was more than a worry, it was a threat to the family's survival, and yet they laughed. One reconstructed lullaby ends with, "Sleep now, or the elves will tickle your toes and trade you for a stone." Half joke, half warning. But entirely Viking. There's another odd fact. Some Viking dolls were found stuffed with goose feathers and sage. Not for play, but to protect against nightmares. Sleep wasn't a guarantee. It was a space women protected fiercely with stories, scents and songs. And always, the cycle turned. Women who survived childbirth earned immense respect. They sat beside elders during gatherings. They advised young brides. They held the knowledge of when to cut the umbilical cord and when to let go of a dying hope. They were makers of life and stewards of death. Imagine a young girl watching her mother dip linen in warm wine to clean a newborn skin. She watches, wide-eyed, asking, "Will I do that one day?" Her mother doesn't answer. She smiles, because in time she will. And the story will continue, not with swords, but with swaddles. Not with blood spilled in battle, but with blood shared in birth. And that, in Viking life, was no less heroic. The fire crackles low in the longhouse, casting golden light on a loom half finished with red and black thread. The house is quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic creak of wooden beams shifting in the cold. In the corner, a woman stirs a pot of herbs, not for food, but for healing. She is a keeper of secrets. A healer, a memory passed down in flesh and instinct. While Viking men were warriors and seafarers, Viking women were caretakers of life in all its fragile forms. And that included knowledge, the kind not found in runestones or sagas, but in fingertips that knew which leaf soothed a fever, which root drew out infection, and which whisper calmed a child seized by fear. We call them healers now. But back then, They had no single title. Some were simply wives or mothers. Others were Lignir, those who treated illness. A rare few were Secunar or Volvus practitioners of seer, blending herbal lore with spiritual power. One recorded tale from the Erbidja saga tells of a woman named Thorgunna. She was no priestess, but she brought with her linen robes, exotic herbs, and an uncanny sense of foresight. After her death, strange things happened. A haunting, a dead man walking. Her belongings were burned to cleanse the space. A reminder that even in death, a healer's influence lingered. Let's step inside her world. A Viking woman preparing medicine would begin early. She'd dry yarrow, grind juniper berries, boil willow bark. She knew how to extract sap from the ash tree, how to mash mugwort into a poultice, all without books, all through trial, error, and inherited memory. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicin, nature's aspirin. And yet, Viking women used it long before chemistry explained why it worked. They simply knew. A sore tooth? Chew the bark. A fever? Brew a bitter tea. Then there was honey. Sacred, sticky, magical. It sealed wounds, drew out infection, and preserved herbs through winter. Some Viking women kept bees not just for wax and sweetener, but for medicine. There's an account in Anglo-Saxon texts, possibly influenced by Norse practice of a salve called 9 herbs charm. It mixes mugwort, plantain, nettle, and other herbs, chanted over with incantations. Whether Viking women used such charms is debated, but archaeological finds suggest they believed words carried power, especially when paired with nature. That's where seer comes in. Seer wasn't just healing. It was magic, divination, and manipulation. Volvus, the women who practiced it, were part priestess, part prophet, part feared outsider. Often elderly, draped in animal skins, carrying staffs carved with runes. They spoke in riddles and trances. The most famous is the Volva. In the saga of Eric the Red, she's described wearing a blue cloak with a catskin hood and beads of glass. She eats a special meal of goat's meat and porridge before entering a trance to tell the future. No one mocks her. She commands the room. Still, not all women who healed were Volvas. Many were simply practical, like the farm wife who noticed that garlic soaked in wine cleaned wounds better than water, or the grandmother who taught her granddaughter to rub feverish feet with goose fat and thyme. One grave in Oseberg, Norway, contained the remains of 2 women buried with tools, herbs, and a mysterious wagon covered in carved animals. Scholars debate whether they were Secunar, aristocrats, or healers. But the presence of henbane seeds, a hallucinogenic herb, suggests they knew more than just cooking. Sometimes, healing crossed into other roles. Women aided in childbirth, yes, but they also treated injuries from battle, frostbite from failed hunts, and strange afflictions of the mind, depression, night terrors, seizures. These were often seen as spiritual attacks or signs that a spirit had taken interest. In those moments, the healer became a shield. She'd wave smoke over the patient, whisper charms in a language half forgotten, press warm stones along the spine. Whether it was science or magic, the result was often the same: comfort, one reconstructed. Viking healing ritual involves 9 steps. Cleanse the space with smoke. Speak the patient's name aloud. Place protective iron near the bed. Brew herbs in mead. Sing or chant during the boiling. Anoint the chest and forehead. Bind the herb-soaked cloth with linen. Let the patient rest by firelight. Repeat. For 3 nights. Sounds theatrical, but in a world without hospitals, theater was medicine. Belief mattered. Rituals anchored the mind, just as herbs anchored the body. Now, imagine this. A woman's son returns from a raid, limping, bloodied. She doesn't panic. She brings hot water, wine, and cloth. She picks bone splinters from his leg. She sings, softly, not a lullaby, but a chant to Odin, asking him to take the pain. It isn't showy. It's survival. One light joke from reconstructed Norse humor says, "If you want a man to listen, feed him first." If you want him to heal, let his wife scold him second. Even in humor, the woman's role is clear. Today, scholars try to categorize Viking healing. Was it folk medicine, witchcraft, or early science? The truth is simpler. It was necessary. And Viking women, for all their spinning, cooking, and child-rearing, carried this knowledge like a second skeleton always there, just beneath the skin. Some say Viking men won the battles, but Viking women made sure their people lived long enough to fight them. The longhouse door creaks open just after sunrise. The woman steps out, basket in hand, cloak pulled tight against the wind. The farm is still goats chewing cud, chickens pecking frozen earth, but her destination lies beyond the fence, past the forest trail, down toward the fjord. Today is market day. And today, she becomes something more than a wife, a mother, a healer. She becomes a trader. In the Viking Age, commerce didn't belong solely to men. Women, especially in Scandinavia, played a central role in trade and barter. Not just behind the scenes, but in open-air markets, bustling harbors, and long-distance networks of goods and gossip. Markets were held at seasonal gatherings or near major settlements like Hidibi, Ribburka, and Koppang. These places weren't just commercial hubs, they were crossroads of culture. One could hear Old Norse alongside Slavic, Arabic, Frankish, or even Persian. And, in the crowd, it wasn't unusual to see a woman holding her ground, haggling for silver, swapping wool for spices, or tallying a sale with beads on her abacus-like tally stick. Let's paint the scene. A woman named Astrid approaches the market square. In her basket, finely woven wool, dyed with madder root and indigo rare, and valuable colors. She also carries dried fish, beeswax, and iron tools forged by her household smith. She sets up a small cloth stall beside a man selling amber beads and a Sami woman offering furs. She greets old friends, eyes the new faces, and watches carefully. As the crowd thickens, one customer, an older man from the east, admires her wool. He tries to underbid her. She smiles politely, counters. He walks away. She doesn't flinch. Moments later, another buyer accepts her price without a word. This wasn't unusual. Archaeological finds show that many Viking women had access to weights and scales, crucial tools of trade. These weren't decorative items. They were worn at the waist, hanging from brooch or belts, and used with confidence. In some graves, like those at Burka, women were buried with merchants' tools, folding scales, weights, and coin pouches. This suggests not only familiarity with commerce, but ownership of enterprise. And Viking commerce wasn't small-scale. Far from it. A single transaction could include dozens of goods: soapstone, whalebone, antlers, honey, salt, linen, silk, glassware, and slaves. Viking women might receive amber from the Baltic, silk from Byzantium, or spices from the Abbasid Caliphate. They traded finished products too. Cloth was a major export, often dyed, patterned, and embroidered. Skilled female weavers turned wool into currency. In fact, in some cases, cloth was used as currency. It had standardized lengths and quality, woven by women, valued by men. But women didn't just work markets, they hosted them. In smaller rural villages, the local market might gather on a farmstead. The woman of the house would organize who set up where, who owed what, and whether disputes needed mediation. And when deals went sour, some women invoked their legal rights. Viking law, particularly in Iceland and parts of Norway, allowed women to bring claims, defend their property, and even collect compensation from defaulting partners. Consider the Graga's law codes from Iceland. They allowed women to inherit land and wealth. And when husbands died, whether at sea or in war, the widows didn't just survive. They traded, managed farms, settled debts, and grew wealthier. In one famous case, a woman named Odd the Deep-Minded settled in Iceland after her sons died. She claimed land, freed slaves, arranged marriages, and hosted feasts, all acts tied to status and economy. Back at the market, Trade isn't just about profit. It's about power. Astrid trades for a silver armband. Not out of vanity, but status. A visible token of success, one she'll wear to the next gathering. She trades wool for dried herbs and beeswax tools for healing and preserving. She even trades gossip, who traveled where, what crops failed, which raiders returned. In Viking culture, information was as valuable as gold. And women were often the keepers of it. As the day fades, Astrid packs her basket lighter now, but richer in return. On her walk home, she passes others heading back, some singing, some grumbling over bad deals. But for her, today wasn't luck. It was work, the kind passed down from mother to daughter. Quiet, patient, tactical. She count her silver later, add it to the household hoard. Perhaps bury it in the hearth, perhaps melt it down, perhaps save it for the next journey. Because here's the truth. Viking trade wasn't fueled solely by swords and sails. It was built on the steady hands of women who spun cloth, kept accounts, and made markets possible. And for every longship full of warriors chasing glory, there was a woman by the fire, bartering with the world. The boat rocks gently in the fjord. Water laps against the hull as morning mist clings to the air. Two young boys reel in nets, soaked to the elbows. And behind them, at the stern of the boat, a woman tightens her cloak and reaches into a woven basket. She doesn't fish. She counts. Not the fish, but the days, the weather, the yield, the hunger on her children's faces, because when it came to food, it was Viking women who carried the burden and the brilliance of feeding an entire household through every season, every drought, and every raid. Their kitchens weren't rooms. They were open hearths, sometimes in the longhouse, sometimes separate in summer buildings. Soot coated the ceiling. Iron pots hung on tripods. Stones lined the firebed for slow, even heat. But the meals weren't bland. Thanks to archaeological remains and residue testing, we now know Viking women used a surprising variety of ingredients and flavorings. Salted fish, boiled meats, smoked lamb, porridge with dried berries, root vegetables, and wild greens made up the core of their diet. And honey. Oh, the honey. Not just for sweetening, but for preservation, mead brewing, and even healing salves. Historians still debate whether Viking food was truly delicious or just tolerable with the right herbs. But one thing is clear, behind every hearty stew or braided loaf of barley bread was a woman managing not just one meal, but the food security of a year. Let's follow one of these women. Her name is Inga. She rises before dawn. Not because it's expected, but because the bread needs to rise and the fire has to be stoked. She checks the larder. Dried meats? A bit low. Saltfish? Still good. Onions and turnips? Sprouting. She adjusts today's plan. There is no grocery store, no backup pantry. Every meal is a math problem made of labor and leftovers. She teaches her daughter how to knead dough using stone-ground barley flour. It sticks under their fingernails. They laugh when a hen pecks its way into the kitchen. Outside, the men prepare to leave on a short trading trip. Inga packs their provisions. Dried fish, hard cheese wrapped in cloth, meat in skin flasks. A few flatbreads, a smoked sausage. She tucks in a charm just in case, because food was never just food. It was medicine, memory, celebration, defense. The midwinter feast Joe was the most important time of the year. Women prepared weeks ahead. Boiled sheep heads, spiced ale, a whole roasted boar, if they could manage it. Honey-buttered breads marked with sun symbols. They lit candles to ward off darkness. They sang to ensure spring's return, and when raids came or sickness or famine, it was the food hoarded, hidden or stretched that determined who survived. Viking. Women dried herbs on rafters, fermented cabbages in buried pots, made cheese from sheep milk and butter from cream. The churn was a daily task. It smelled of labor. It sounded like life. One odd fact: Vikings used seaweed in their cooking. Not just as livestock feed, but as a nutritious thickener in broths or filler in bread during hard winters. Modern labs have even confirmed the presence of iodine and alginates in Viking-era residue. And speaking of strange meals, some records mention a type of porridge made with ground bones and animal blood, nutritious, if not exactly mouth-watering. But for Vikings, waste was sin. Every part of an animal had a use. The food rituals extended beyond the hearth. At births, women boiled special infusions to help labor. At funerals, the bereaved fasted, then feasted, honoring the dead with favorite dishes. One preserved Norse tale even recounts a widow preparing her husband's last meal: roasted goat, oatcakes, and mead, and sharing it with the village before his burial in a ship grave. These weren't acts of grief alone. They were acts of command. Because in feeding others, Viking women held invisible power. They rationed. They chose who ate first. They soothed warriors, healed children, fed priests. They made food into culture, memory into flavor. But this wasn't easy work. Winters were brutal. Cattle sometimes died. Food stores froze or spoiled. And women had to adapt. Some turned to the sea, harvesting mussels, collecting driftwood for fires, boiling seawater for salt. Others foraged for mushrooms, wild garlic, sorrel, and crowberries, nature's quiet offerings. Inga does this too. On a late autumn afternoon, she gathers her daughter and walks into the forest. The crunch of leaves, the bite of wind, the smell of damp bark. They find elderberries and hazelnuts, digging them from underbrush. They sing old songs to keep away spirits. She reminds her daughter not to eat the red mushrooms. Only look, never taste. Back at home, they dry the elderberries over the hearth. She add them to stew. Maybe for Jarl, and maybe her daughter will do the same, years from now. Because Viking food wasn't preserved in cookbooks, it was preserved in hands. Habits, homes, stories. The last log in the fire crackles. Inga places the final bowl of stew on the longhouse table. Her sons argue over portions. Her husband arrives, cloaked damp with rain. Her youngest reaches for honey. She smiles, not because the work is done. It never is, but because everyone is fed for now, and in a world of uncertainty, that's enough to call it a victory. The wind rushes along the ridge, whistling past birch trees and tugging at the woolen cloaks of two figures walking silently across the hillside. A boy trails behind, dragging a bundle of thin branches. The woman ahead carries something heavier, something wrapped in cloth, nestled in her arms like a sleeping lamb. Except it isn't a lamb. And this isn't a peaceful morning walk. It's a burial. And in the Viking world, women didn't just mourn the dead. They prepared them. They honored them. And sometimes they led the very rituals that guided souls into the afterlife. When most people think of Viking death, they picture flames, burning ships, fiery send-offs. But for many, especially in the inland settlements, the dead were buried in mounds, carefully, ritualistically, with objects of meaning. And women played a central role in every step. As the caretakers of the home, Viking women were also the caretakers of final moments. The scene unfolds like a quiet ballet. A dying elder is washed tenderly, completely, by the women of the household. Coins are placed over her eyes. Her favorite cloak is wrapped around her shoulders, a comb, a brooch, a loaf of bread, all tucked into her arms for the journey ahead. Historians still debate whether women acted as priests in these moments. Some argue they held spiritual power, similar to the seeresses known as Volvas mystics, who guided ceremonies and read omens from bones, dreams, or even the sky. Others believe their role was more domestic, less mystic, more practical. But consider this. In grave after grave across Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered high-status women buried with staffs, rings, and symbols of spiritual authority. One of the most famous burials at Oseberg contains not just a woman, but a wagon, sleds, woven tapestries, and a possible ritual staff carved with serpents. An odd find? In that same grave was a bucket of apples, sealed tightly. Why? Perhaps a gift to the gods, or a treat for the afterlife, or maybe a reminder of what was sweet in life. The truth may never be known. But in the Viking home, death wasn't sudden. It was prepared for. The hearth was extinguished, the mirrors covered. A silence filled the space as women moved between the world of the living and the unknown beyond. For wives and mothers, grief was woven into duty. They led chants. They braided hair. They held the hands of children who didn't understand. And they stood at the head of processions carrying torches, singing dirges, casting flowers into the earth. Some women, particularly those of wealth, were given ship burials. Not the flaming kind, but actual ships buried in the ground, surrounded by grave goods, chests of silk, jewelry, tools, and food. Sometimes even servants. Yes, human sacrifice was rare, but real. Written accounts by Arab travelers speak of a Viking funeral in which a slave girl volunteered or was chosen to accompany her master into death. She was dressed, honored, intoxicated, and ritually slain before being laid beside him. Unthinkable? Certainly, but it speaks to the strange and complex relationship Viking society had with life and death, and the gendered roles within it, because it wasn't just women preparing the dead. Sometimes they were the dead, and their graves tell rich stories. One skeleton, buried in Denmark, was found with keys hanging at her waist, a symbol of household power. Another held iron shears and spindle whirls, tools of her trade. Some had amulets shaped like hammers, Thor's blessing. Others bore crosses. That's right. In the final centuries of the Viking Age, as Christianity crept into the north, burial customs began to shift. Fewer grave goods, more east-facing graves, simpler clothing, and women, who once orchestrated elaborate pagan rites, began to whisper Christian prayers instead. Yet even then, the roles of women in these transitions were critical. They were the memory keepers. One small joke that circulated in Norse oral traditions poked fun at women's storytelling at funerals. Tell the tale short, lest the mead run dry. But of course, the tales were never short. They were entire lives, spoken in rhythm, sung like lullabies for the dead. And let's not forget one very strange custom: grave reuse. In lean times, older burial mounds were opened, cleared, and reused. Sometimes, decades later, bones might be moved, objects taken. And often, it was the women who made these practical but eerie decisions. Imagine that. Cleaning out a grave to make space. Like tidying a guest room. For Viking women, birth and death were in separate worlds. They lived close together, like neighbors separated by a thin wall. One day they were midwives, coaxing new cries into the air. The next, they were funeral singers, quieting those cries forever. In the longhouse, the line between joy and sorrow blurred. Inga, our familiar figure, kneels beside her mother's grave. It's early spring. The ground is soft from thaw. She plants a small bunch of wild thyme at the base of the stone. Her daughter watches. Neither speaks. A bird chirps from the tree above. Later, they'll walk back to the hearth, start the bread, stir the stew. Life goes on, even as it carries grief tucked quietly into its sleeves. And in this way, Viking women weren't just figures of the past. They were time travelers carrying traditions forward, across generations, through song, through scent, through every ritual movement. The fire in the longhouse flickers again. Shadows dance. A name is whispered, then silenced. And the world keeps spinning. Somewhere on the northern coast, salt clings to the morning mist, and the cry of gulls pierces the stillness. In a quiet inlet, a woman kneels beside a boat, not to sail, but to sell. She runs her fingers along the wooden ribs, checking for cracks, just as her father once taught her. Beside her, her teenage son watches, impatient, shifting from foot to foot. He doesn't know what she's about to do, but she does, because trade was never just a man's world in Viking society. Behind the spears and sails, it was women clever, sharp-eyed, and endlessly adaptable, who fueled the silent engine of commerce. They may not have crossed the North Sea with swords in hand, but they knew every ounce of silver tucked inside the pouches of passing traders. And when it came to bartering, many held the upper hand. Viking women, especially those of higher status or in widowhood, often managed estates. With their husbands gone to sea or war, women oversaw the production and sale of cloth, dairy, grain, and livestock. They counted coins, measured weight, bartered at seasonal markets. And for some, business was more than survival, it was power. Historical records from Hidibi and Reb, bustling Viking market towns, show clear signs of female involvement. Weaving sheds filled with looms, stalls where finely embroidered caps were sold. Storage houses stocked with honey, salt, and mead. In a famous excavation from Birka in Sweden, a woman was found buried with scales and weights, the tools of a merchant. Some archaeologists still argue whether the grave belonged to a man misidentified as female, or whether it proves the economic clout women held. Historians still debate whether such women were widespread or rare exceptions. But across the archaeological record, evidence keeps piling up. Women didn't just run homes. They ran trade. One odd find: a silver coin hoard buried beneath a longhouse clearly stashed by a woman based on associated grave goods. The oddity? The coins came from Baghdad. Yes, Baghdad. Through long trade routes winding eastward from Scandinavia, Viking merchants, both men and women, carried furs, amber, and slaves, and returned with silk, spices, and silver. The women who stayed behind weren't just passive recipients of these goods. They were the economic strategists. Picture this. Astrid, a widow in her 50s, sits beside her hearth, a counting stones lined up beside her. She's calculating how much she can trade her wool for at the spring fair. Her daughter is learning, silently watching, stitching runes into cloth to protect it from being undersold. Astrid's fingers move quickly. Not even the local thing, the assembly of free men, dares argue with her prices. Her wool is known, her butter is clean. Her word is trusted. At the heart of this independence were the keys Viking women wore at their waists, literal keys hanging from their belt, symbols of their authority over the storerooms and wealth of the home. These weren't decoration. They unlocked the very heart of the family's resources. When men went raiding, the household didn't pause. The women expanded it. Even the law recognized a woman's rights over property. In some regions, widows could reclaim their dowry, manage land, and even take cases to court. A married woman, depending on her family's wealth, might oversee multiple farms, servants, and trade arrangements, all while raising children and preserving the family's honor. And no, they weren't shy about enforcing contracts. Take the Icelandic sagas. Peppered throughout them are stories of women who pursued debts, CHALLENGED, neighbors over land disputes, or called witnesses to back their claims. One woman even physically ejected a man from her property, using, of all things, a ladle. Not exactly a sword, but effective. Another woman, odd, the deep-minded, after being widowed, didn't crumble. She built ships, sailed to Iceland with her kin, claimed land, and became a prominent settler matriarch. Her land divisions still bear her name. She wasn't just a legend. She was real. Inga, now older, walks through the market square, her shawl pulled tight, silver threading catching the sun. A younger woman approaches with a basket of apples. They nod a silent agreement made years before. Inga's cloth for her fruit. No coin needed. She may not carry a sword, but she carries stories of trades made, of wool weighed, of deals struck while children clung to her skirts, of how the world moved because women kept track of what mattered. One light joke, often heard among merchants: behind every successful voyage is a woman sighing over the missing ledger. Because while men bragged of plunder, it was women who tallied the profits. Even young girls learned early. Spindle in one hand, price in the other. Not just to survive, but to thrive. The sound of hammering rises from a nearby booth. A blacksmith, one of the few male-only trades, nods respectfully to Inga. She nods back, chin high. Her name is known, her word valued. Some Viking women may have worn rings of iron, symbolizing their bond to husbands. But more often, they wore keys and knives and thread, symbols of creation, preservation, and protection. And within that toolkit, commerce was quietly mastered. As Christianity spread, women's economic roles shifted. Church laws began limiting female inheritance, dowries shrank, male guardianship expanded. But in the Viking Age, before the full weight of the church descended, women stood firm in the marketplace. Not beside men, but often ahead of them. A final oddity? A rune carved into a merchant's stall reads, "Kara kept the accounts well. Beware of short measures." A warning and a legacy. Because in the Viking world, being fair wasn't just honorable. It was profitable. As the sun sets over the harbor, Inga's ship, once used for coastal trade, is sold to a younger woman, eyes bright with ambition. Inga doesn't haggle. She smiles, adjusts her cloak, and walks back toward the longhouse. The silver weighs heavy in her pouch, but the pride that walks beside her, step for step. The longhouse grows quiet. Children lean against furs, bellies full from evening porridge, the fire snapping low. Outside, frost creeps across the wooden beams. Inside, a voice rises in the hush. It's not just a story. It's memory, power, identity. And it begins with a name, Freya, the Norse goddess of love, beauty, battle, and sorcery. One of the most revered deities in all the Viking pantheon, and a reflection of the women who told her tales. Viking mythology is filled with powerful female figures. They weren't secondary characters or moral lessons. They were rulers of realms, givers of fate, and warriors in their own right. Freya, for instance, wasn't only a goddess of desire. She also received half the dead slain in battle. Her hall, Folkvanger, rivaled Odin's Valhalla. Warriors who fell with bravery might end up under her watch, not his. That's no small claim, and she practiced a form of magic rooted in fate-weaving, visions, and manipulation of reality. It was said that Freya taught this magic to Odin himself. She wasn't his student. She was his teacher. In real Viking society, women who practiced Ser were both respected and feared. They were called Valvasyresses, walking between worlds, consulted in matters of war, harvest, and death. These women held staffs, wore elaborate cloaks, and often traveled alone from settlement to settlement. Bones in their pouches, secrets in their eyes. One famous grave from Oseberg, Norway, held the remains of two women, one older, one younger, buried in a richly decorated ship with tapestries, tools, and exotic goods. Many scholars believe one may have been a Volva, a priestess of great power. Her burial rivaled that of kings. Beyond Freya, there were others. Frigg, wife of Odin, was no passive queen. She saw the future, but spoke little of it. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Frigg represented foresight, wisdom, and the quiet strength of enduring hardship. Many Viking women, living lives of loss and resilience, saw themselves in her stillness. Then came Skadia, goddess of the mountains, huntress, clad in snowshoes, bow always ready. She chose her husband from the gods by looking only at their feet. A sharp reminder that appearances deceive, and choices matter. There were darker figures too. Hel, daughter of Loki, ruled over the underworld. Half her face was alive, the other half dead. She was feared, yes, but she was also inevitable. Death was part of life, and Hel waited for those who didn't die in battle. Quiet, cold, absolute. Even the Fates, the Norns, were women, 3 sisters, who wove the threads of life, one for birth, one for what is, and one for what will be. Number, man, god, or creature could change their weaving. Not even Odin. To the Vikings, these stories weren't just myths. They were explanations for the forces they saw in their own mothers, sisters, and daughters. In a harsh world, strength came in many forms, and often it was female. By the hearth, sagas passed from grandmother to child. They weren't read from books. They were performed. Sung, etched into memory like runes into stone. Freya rode a chariot drawn by cats, one would say, laughing, brushing back the hair of a sleepy child. But don't mistake her for soft. When giants came for her necklace, she cursed them with madness. Or, Skadi walks the snow alone, and the mountains bow. To her, these weren't bedtime stories. They were mirrors. Young girls grew up hearing that women shape the world, just like the Norns shaped fate. That wisdom, magic, love, and even death bore a woman's name. Even the Valkyries, those fierce warrior spirits, flew over battlefields, choosing who would live and who would die. They weren't angels, they were deciders. And the women listening? They understood. That's why the most fearsome insult in Viking times wasn't to be called weak. It was to be called unwomanly. Because to be a woman meant enduring childbirth, running households, preserving memory, holding families together, and facing death without flinching. The gods reflected the people, and the people remembered the gods. In longhouses, women carved runes into amulets, prayed to Frigg for wisdom, called on Freya in childbirth, offered meat and mead to the ancestors. Even as Christianity crept northward, the old ways clung to the bones of the land. Freya's name lived on in flowers, hell in whispers at funerals, the Norns in every tale told beside a cradle. And today, archaeologists still uncover amulets shaped like Freya's Brisingamen necklace, still find staffs buried with women covered in silver, still read sagas written long after the Viking Age ended, stories that wouldn't exist if women hadn't remembered them. Because Viking women weren't just characters in myths, they were the tellers of them. And without them, the myths would have died in silence. So as the fire dims in the longhouse and the last child drifts to sleep, the voice still lingers. A story finished. A spell cast. In that breath of silence, a truth hums in the air. That memory is a weapon, and women, then as now, have always known how to wield it. Centuries have passed since longships sliced through northern waters and runes were carved into stone. The Viking Age ended, kingdoms rose and fell, languages changed, and new gods took the old gods' place. But some things, like the legacy of Viking women, didn't vanish. They transformed. Because history doesn't disappear. It hides in plain sight. And sometimes it speaks louder through silence. In the early days of archaeology, Viking graves were unearthed across Scandinavia. Most were assumed to be male, especially the ones buried with weapons, horses, and wealth. After all, who else would merit a warrior's burial? But science had other plans. In 2017, a grave in Birka, Sweden, one of the most famous Viking warrior burials, was revealed to belong to a woman, not just any woman. She was buried with a full set of weapons, including a sword and axe, 2 horses, and a strategy board game used to teach battlefield tactics. Her DNA left no room for doubt. The warrior was female. And suddenly, everything scholars thought they knew needed to be reconsidered. That revelation cracked open a new chapter in our understanding. It wasn't just about women fighting, it was about how Viking women had been overlooked in the telling of their own story. From then on, researchers looked differently at burial goods: distaffs, beads, keys, knives, looms, animals, and herbs. These weren't trinkets or tokens. They were evidence of status, responsibility, power, and purpose. Viking women's legacy isn't just trapped in tombs or sagas, it breathes in modern law, culture, and imagination. In Scandinavian societies, many of the gender-equal principles they pride themselves on today trace back to Viking norms. Women in the Viking Age could own and inherit land, file for divorce, conduct business, testify in court, lead religious ceremonies. These weren't radical rights, just everyday parts of life. Of course, Viking society wasn't perfectly equal. Roles were still divided and power concentrated among the elite. But compared to the rest of medieval Europe, Norse women had more rights, more voice, and more space to shape their world. And that's not all. Modern popular culture has embraced the Viking woman not as a background figure, but a force to be reckoned with. Shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom introduced millions to powerful characters like Lagertha, a legendary shield maiden whose story, though partly myth, was rooted in real Norse tradition. And while creative license plays a role, the fascination with strong Viking women has sparked deeper interest in historical accuracy and forgotten heroines. Even the fashion world has caught on. Jewelry inspired by Norse brooch, braided hairstyles, and embroidered tunics, all once functional, are now reimagined as emblems of identity and pride. In academia, female scholars are leading the charge in re-evaluating Viking history. They ask new questions, retranslate old texts, and examine remains with fresh eyes. They refuse to let the past be told by only half its participants. Museums across Scandinavia now highlight the role of women in Viking society, not as footnotes, but as focal points. Interactive exhibits explore the lives of priestesses, farmers, merchants, and warriors. And in schools, children read sagas aloud, reenact stories of gods and mortals, and learn that Viking greatness wasn't just forged on the battlefield. It was grown in fields, whispered in hallways, and passed down through women's voices. But perhaps the truest legacy of Viking women lives outside the textbooks. It lives in every girl who's told she's strong. Not just sweet. In every woman who takes up space in rooms she was once barred from. In every family passed down through mothers as much as fathers. In every story remembered, retold, and reimagined. So next time you picture a Viking, don't just see a bearded warrior with a shield. See a woman bent over a loom, weaving warmth into winter. See a Volva with a staff and a vision, feared by kings. See a mother teaching her child to recite the names of gods and the meaning of storms. See the one who stayed when others left. See the one who remembered when others forgot. Because behind every longship sailed and every saga sung, there was always a Viking woman, watching, waiting, working, surviving. And making sure the story would never be lost.